My name is Thomas Mercer. I am 67 years old, and I have spent 31 years as a federal fraud prosecutor, putting people exactly like my son-in-law behind bars. Last Thanksgiving, he sat at my dining room table, smiled at me over my late wife's china, and told me I was being unreasonable. 20 minutes later, when I refused to sign a document, he slid across that table. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it hard enough to fracture the bone. As I drove myself to the emergency room, I typed one message to my attorney. It said, "The turkey has walked into the oven." What Derek Walsh did not know, what none of them knew, is that I had been building this case against him for 8 months. And I had been waiting for exactly this moment. Let me tell you where this really started. My daughter Claire is 39 years old. She has her mother's eyes and, for most of her life, her mother's good judgment. Margaret, my wife, my partner for 42 years, passed away from pancreatic cancer 3 years ago. It was the kind of loss that hollows you out slowly, the kind that makes your house feel like a museum exhibit of everything you used to have. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the friends stopped calling, I threw myself back into the work I knew: consulting, expert witness testimony, a few pro bono cases for a nonprofit that helps small business owners identify financial fraud before it destroys them. It kept my mind sharp. It kept me sane. Claire met Derek Walsh at a work conference 14 months after her mother died. I remember the first time she brought him to dinner. He was handsome in that calculated way, the kind of handsome that comes with rehearsal. Good clothes, firm handshake, lots of eye contact. He called me sir and asked intelligent questions about my career and laughed at the right moments. Margaret would have seen through him in 40 seconds. She had a gift for that. I did not have her gift. I had something less elegant, 31 years of reading deposition transcripts and watching men lie under oath, and even I missed it the first time. They married 11 months after they met. I paid for the wedding, which was their first ask. I smiled and wrote the check, because that is what fathers do. I bought them a house as a wedding gift. Not the house, my house, but a house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Fairfax County that I purchased outright for $312,000. Derek said it was too generous. He said it 3 times, which is exactly how many times a man says something he doesn't mean. Claire cried. She said I was the best father in the world. I believed her. That was my mistake. The change happened gradually, the way these things always do. Claire stopped calling as often. When she did call, she sounded careful, like someone reading from a script. She canceled dinners twice in a row, then a third time. When I asked if everything was all right, she said Derek was stressed about work and she didn't want to leave him alone. I asked what kind of stress. She said investment stuff, complicated. I wouldn't understand it. That last part landed strangely. Claire had never once in 39 years suggested there was something I wouldn't understand. I started paying attention the way I used to pay attention in a courtroom, quietly, without showing my hand. What I found took me 4 months to piece together, and when it was complete, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time and just looked at it. Derek Walsh was not an investment manager. He had a Series 65 license, which he had obtained on his 3rd attempt, and he had used it to build a small client book of mostly older investors who trusted him because he had a nice tie and knew how to sit across a desk and sound confident. Over the past 2 years, he had been moving money, not embezzling in the simple sense, something more sophisticated, which is always more reckless. He was running a side structure where he directed clients into a private fund that he controlled, collected fees, and used a portion of those fees to cover gambling losses that, according to the records my private investigator obtained, totaled just under $400,000. His broker-dealer had begun an internal audit 8 weeks ago. The SEC had received a referral. The walls were closing in, and Derek Walsh knew it. He also knew that I owned a house worth, at current market value, approximately $1.4 million. A house with no mortgage. A house that held 42 years of my life with Margaret, including the rose garden she planted the spring before she got sick, and the reading room she designed herself with the built-in shelves that went floor to ceiling. A house he had visited exactly 6 times and never once called anything other than a lot of space for one person. Claire had no idea what her husband had been doing. I was almost certain of that. Almost. I needed to be sure before I moved. I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Park, who had worked with me for 15 years, and who, when I explained the situation, said only, "Tell me what you need, and I'll have it ready." That is what a good attorney sounds like. Sandra began preparing documents, while I began the other part, the part that required patience I did not entirely feel. I installed cameras in my home. Not obvious ones. I had used the same security consultant for years, a former Secret Service technical specialist named Roy, and within 3 days, I had high-definition coverage of the living room, the dining room, the front hallway, and the study. Every feed was encrypted and stored off-site. I also had Roy install a small microphone in the reading room, the room Derek had once called a waste of square footage, and one in the hallway outside the guest bedroom. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Sandra had confirmed it twice. Then I waited for Thanksgiving. The invitation came from Claire, which surprised me. We had spent the last 2 Thanksgivings at their house, an arrangement Derek clearly preferred because it meant he controlled the setting. When Claire called and suggested my house this year, I heard something in her voice that I had not heard in months. It was small and quick, and she covered it immediately. But I caught it. She sounded relieved, like she was asking me for something she wasn't allowed to ask for directly. "Of course," I said. "I would love to have you both here. Claire, I'll make your mother's stuffing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I miss her, Dad." "I know, sweetheart. I do too." After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen and looked out at Margaret's rose garden, which I had kept exactly as she left it, and I made a promise to her that I intended to keep. The week before Thanksgiving, I met with Sandra and finalized everything. The Mercer Family Irrevocable Trust had been established 14 months earlier, the same month Claire and Derek married, and had been funded with every significant asset I owned. The house, my investment accounts, the remainder of my pension, and the consulting income I had set aside over 3 years. It was all in the trust. Sandra was the trustee. The house no longer legally belonged to me. It belonged to the trust, and the trust's terms were specific. If I passed, the entire estate would be liquidated, and the proceeds donated to the Margaret Mercer Foundation for Pancreatic Cancer Research, which Sandra and I had quietly incorporated 6 months ago. Derek Walsh was going to come to my house and ask for a piece of it, and I was going to let him believe he had a chance of getting one. Sandra had one more thing to prepare: a single document, a convincing but entirely worthless quitclaim deed that appeared, on its surface, to transfer a 50% interest in my home to Claire Walsh, née Mercer. It was real paper, real legal formatting, Sandra's real notary seal. It was also completely void, because you cannot transfer an interest in a property that you do not own. It was a decoy, a professional courtesy. I also had Roy confirm the cameras one final time on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. He checked every feed, every microphone, and then looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has done enough surveillance work to know when something is about to happen. "You want me on standby Thursday?" he asked. I told him to enjoy his turkey. I had everything I needed. Thanksgiving morning was cold and bright. I spent 2 hours in Margaret's garden, even though there was nothing to tend in November. I just sat there with coffee and talked to her the way I had gotten in the habit of doing. I told her what was coming. I told her I was sorry I hadn't seen it sooner, that I had been so busy grieving her that I had missed what was happening to our daughter. I told her I was going to fix it. By 4 o'clock I had a 22-pound turkey in the oven, Margaret's stuffing warming on the stove, and every camera in the house running green. I had also placed a slim digital recorder in the chest pocket of my sweater. Insurance, Sandra called it. I called it professional habit. They arrived at 6. I heard the car in the driveway and watched through the living room window for a moment before going to the door. Derek got out first. He was dressed well, as always, gray slacks, a dark wool coat, the kind of groomed presentation that takes 20 minutes in front of a mirror. He stood in the driveway and looked at the house the way a buyer looks at a listing, not the way a son-in-law looks at his father-in-law's home. His eyes moved from the roofline to the windows to the garage. He was appraising it. Claire came around from the passenger side. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. She looked like someone who had been bracing for something for a long time. When she looked up and saw me on the porch, her face changed for just a second, opened up into something younger, something that was my daughter before any of this. And then Derek said her name, and she composed herself again. Thomas. Derek extended his hand as they came up the steps. Great to see you. Place looks terrific. I shook his hand and looked at my daughter. I looked at her the way a father looks when he needs to understand something. She met my eyes, and in hers I saw what I had been afraid to name for months. She knew something was wrong. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough, and she was scared. Come in, I said. Dinner's almost ready. The first hour was performance. Derek was good at performance. He asked about my consulting work, with the kind of attention that is designed to look like interest but is actually reconnaissance. How busy was I? How far did I travel? How was the income these days? I answered everything vaguely and watched him recalibrate with each answer, the way a card counter adjusts his bet. Claire ate quietly. She refilled her wine twice. It was when I brought out the dessert, Margaret's apple pie, the one Claire had asked for specifically, that Derek decided it was time. He waited until I sat back down. He waited until Claire had taken a single bite of pie, the way you wait for a moment of calm before you introduce chaos. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his wool coat, which was hanging on his chair, and he placed a document on the table in front of me. It was a quitclaim deed. His version of one. Thomas, he said, his voice steady and practiced. Claire and I have been talking, and we think it makes sense to formalize what we've all known for a long time. This is Claire's home, too. It's where she grew up. It's where Margaret, he paused, said her name like he owned the right to use it, where she spent her whole life. We think Claire should have her name on the deed. For security. For peace of mind. For all of you? He slid it toward me. I looked at the document. I looked at it with the same flat attention I used to look at fraudulent loan applications and fabricated financial statements. And I read every word, slowly, deliberately. It was a standard form, filled in by someone who knew the right vocabulary. It would have transferred a 50% undivided interest in my property to Claire Walsh. Signed by me, it would have given Derek, as Claire's husband, a legal claim to that interest in any number of subsequent proceedings. Claire was very still. She was not looking at the deed. She was looking at her apple pie. This is quite a conversation for Thanksgiving dinner, I said. It's a good time, Derek said. Family together, no distractions. We thought he used that word, thought, with a particular emphasis, the emphasis of a man who has done all the thinking for both of them. We thought it would be good to take care of this while we're all in the same room. Keep it simple. I set the document down. I folded my hands on the table. Derek, I said, why is Claire not looking at me? The question landed exactly where I intended. Derek's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Claire slowly looked up. Her face was red, and she pressed her lips together. And in that moment, I understood the full shape of what had been happening in that house in Fairfax for the past year. He had coached her. He had scripted this, and she had been carrying the weight of it alone. Dad, she started. You don't have to say anything, I told her. Not right now. Derek leaned forward. His voice dropped to a register that was meant to sound gentle, but was actually the sound of someone tightening a grip. Thomas, this is a straightforward thing. It's about protecting your daughter. Surely you want Claire to have security. You want her to be taken care of. If something happened to you. This is how you do that. This is responsible estate planning. I want to hear it from her, I said. I looked at Claire. Sweetheart, is this what you want? The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Derek did not break it. He had the discipline to stay quiet and let the pressure work. But Claire had 42 years of her mother's instincts in her, and in those 4 seconds I watched something shift on her face. Derek needs me to say yes, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Derek turned toward her. Claire, it's true. She raised her eyes to his, and the fear in them was the kind that has lived in a person for a long time. It's true, Derek. He should know. Something changed in Derek Walsh's face. The performance fell away. Underneath it was something cold and calculating, and I recognized with professional precision, frightened. A frightened man in a corner is a predictable man. He would escalate. I had banked on it. He looked back at me. He picked up the deed. He placed it in front of me again, closer this time. Sign it, Thomas. He did not use the word please. He did not use the word sir. Sign it, and this stays in the family. Don't sign it, and I start making calls Monday morning to people who are going to want to know about some of your past cases. I have names, Thomas. I have clients of yours you consulted for. I have suggestions about where certain funds may have gone. Sign it, and this is a family Thanksgiving. Don't sign it, and I start talking. There it was. The threat. The amateur's last move when the pretty approach stops working. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile a courtroom develops in a person, after enough years small, contained, and utterly without warmth. Derek, I said, I spent 31 years prosecuting financial fraud for the federal government. The last thing a person like me has is exposure. But you might want to think carefully about who in this room has a great deal of it. His jaw tightened. Don't threaten me, old man. I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you. There is a difference. I learned to tell them apart a long time ago. He stood up. He was 6 feet tall and 41 years old, and he was used to using the physical fact of himself to change the temperature in a room. He came around the side of the table. He reached down, and he grabbed my right wrist in both hands, and he twisted. The pain was immediate and specific, a sharp crack that I felt before I heard it, followed by a white-hot wave that ran to my elbow. I had not expected that. I had expected a great deal from Derek Walsh, but I had not expected him to be stupid enough to do that in a room with 3 active cameras and a recording device in my sweater pocket. Later, the orthopedic report would describe it as an undisplaced distal radius fracture, 3 to 4 weeks in a splint. Derek Walsh would describe it to the police as an accident. The camera above the sideboard would describe it as something else entirely. Claire screamed. She shoved back her chair and knocked it over, standing up. Derek, stop. Stop it. She was between us in 2 steps, her hands on his arm, pulling him back. Are you insane? Are you out of your mind? He let go. He stepped back. He straightened his coat with the automatic reflex of a man trying to reassemble his composure, and what I saw in that half-second, the recalculation, the pivot to damage control, was the clearest portrait of his character I had ever seen. I stood up slowly. I held my right wrist against my chest. The pain was significant. I breathed through it. Claire was crying. Dad! Dad! Are you? She reached for me. I let her hold my arm for a moment. I looked at her face, really looked at it, and I saw the relief there. Even in the middle of this, there was relief, because it was out now. It was finally, irreversibly, out in the open, and whatever came next, she no longer had to carry the weight of pretending it wasn't. I'm all right, I told her quietly. Sit down, sweetheart. Sit down and don't say anything else tonight. She sat. Derek was standing by the window now, his back partially turned, running his hand through his hair. He was running calculations I could almost hear. I picked up my car keys from the hook by the kitchen door. I picked up my phone. I walked to the front door. Derek turned. Where are you going? Emergency room, I said. I'll need a report. You're not going to? He stopped. I turned around and looked at him from the doorway. I looked at him the way I used to look at defendants right before the verdict. Derek, you just fractured the wrist of a retired federal prosecutor in a room with 4 cameras and a live recording device. I want you to sit here and think very carefully about what you did tonight and what the next several years of your life are going to look like. I left. I drove to Inova Fairfax Hospital. I drove at the speed limit. My wrist was wrapped in a dish towel I had taken from the kitchen drawer, and I held it steady against my steering wheel with a calm that surprised me. I had expected, if I'm honest, to feel something heavier in this moment. Grief, maybe, or rage. What I felt was a clarity so clean and complete, it was almost like peace. In the emergency room, I gave my name and my date of birth to the triage nurse. I told her, in precise and unhurried language, that I had sustained an injury at my home during a family dinner, that the injury was the result of my son-in-law grabbing and twisting my wrist, and that I was a retired federal prosecutor and I would be filing a formal police report. I asked her to page hospital security. She looked at my wrist and looked at my face and picked up the phone. The attending physician, a focused young woman named Dr. Kessler, examined the fracture and ordered imaging. While we waited for the X-ray results, I asked her for two things. First, a complete and detailed documentation of the injury, including her professional assessment of whether it was consistent with a deliberate twisting force applied by a second party, which she confirmed it was. Second, a copy of every record from this visit, paid out of pocket, with a stamped receipt. She understood. She had done this before. I texted Sandra from the imaging room. My message said, "The turkey has walked into the oven. Wrist fracture. Innova Fairfax. Cameras captured everything. Phase 1 is complete." Her reply came in 40 seconds. On my way. I also sent one message to Claire. It said only, "I know this wasn't your idea. I'm not angry at you. Stay at the house tonight." The police officer who took my report was a 20-year veteran named Sergeant Albright, who arrived in the imaging room while Dr. Kessler was splinting my wrist. I told him everything I knew. I told him about Derek's finances. I told him about the deed, which I had not signed. I told him about the cameras in my home and the recording device in my pocket, from which I played him a 30-second excerpt. He listened to all of it without interruption, and when I finished, he looked at me for a moment. "You said you're a retired federal prosecutor." 31 years, I said. He nodded slowly. "And you had cameras already set up." 8 months of preparation, I said. He just provided the finale. Sergeant Albright wrote for a long time in his notebook. He did not use the word accident. Sandra arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later, briefcase in hand, the exact expression on her face of someone who has been preparing for a phone call for a long time and is entirely unsurprised to receive it. She sat down beside me in the treatment room, looked at the splint on my wrist, and said, "How bad?" "Undisplaced fracture. 3 to 4 weeks. And on camera? Every second." She exhaled once. "All right. What do you want to do?" "I want to do it the right way," I said, "which means I want him to think, at least until Monday morning, that I'm a scared old man who isn't going to press charges. I want him to think I'm too embarrassed, too worried about the family, too tired to fight." Sandra looked at me. "Tom, I know how it sounds, but desperate people don't go home and reflect. They accelerate. I need him to make the next move before Sandra Park and Thomas Mercer make ours." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The cameras are still live?" "Recording to the off-site server," I said. "Roy confirmed it this morning." She opened her briefcase and took out a folder. "Then I'll go talk to the officer." She stood up. "And Tom," she paused at the curtain. "What about Claire?" I looked at the splint on my wrist. Claire was the part of this I had spent 8 months trying not to think about too directly. Because thinking about it directly meant sitting with the fact that my daughter had been living inside a slow disaster and I had not moved fast enough to stop it. "Claire is the reason I waited," I said. "I needed enough to take him all the way down. No plea deals, no fines, no anger management course, and a misdemeanor. I needed to make sure he could never do this to her again, or to anyone else." Sandra nodded once and went to find Sergeant Albright. I played my role perfectly. When Albright returned and gently suggested I file a formal assault complaint, I shook my head. I let my voice sound uncertain. I said I needed time to think. I said Derek was my daughter's husband and I didn't want to destroy the family over a misunderstanding. I said I was 67 years old and I just wanted to go home. Albright had the patient, grieved expression of a man who had watched too many people refuse the help they needed. He gave me a card. He told me these situations escalate. He told me to call if anything else happened. I thanked him and told him I would keep his card. Sandra drove me back to my house at 11 o'clock. The lights were on. Derek's car was still in the driveway. We sat outside for a moment with the engine off. "What do you think they're doing?" Sandra asked. I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted feed. Camera 3, the dining room, empty, plates still on the table. Camera 1, the living room. Derek was on his phone, pacing. Camera 4, the hallway outside the guest room. Claire was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her knees pulled up, not moving. That's what I thought, I said. Sandra watched the screen with me. Derek was talking fast and low. The kind of fast and low that means the conversation is about damage control. I turned up the audio. He was talking to someone, not Claire, talking about Thomas and what he did, how it was an accident, how the old man was going to make this into something it wasn't, how they needed to get ahead of it. I heard him say, "We need to move on the house before he does something stupid. If he changes the title while I've got legal exposure, we're done." And there it was. Not concern, not remorse, real estate strategy at 11 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, with his wife sitting on a floor 15 feet away. Sandra made a quiet sound. "I'll have the papers ready at 8 tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll be there at 7:30, I said. I did not go inside. I spent the night at Sandra's guest room, which, unlike the hotel breadcrumb I had laid for Derek by mentioning the name of a downtown hotel to Albright, was real. I slept better than I had in months. By 7:45 Friday morning, the following things were in motion. Sandra had filed for an emergency protective order on the basis of the fracture and the recorded threat Derek had made at my dinner table. Sergeant Albright had been contacted by a colleague in the Financial Crimes Unit, a unit that had, as it turned out, been tracking a referral involving a broker named Derek Walsh for the past 6 weeks. And Roy, at my request, had activated the secondary feature of my home security system, a notification that would alert me the moment any exterior door was opened. At 8:12 Friday morning, my phone buzzed. Front door. I watched on the feed. Derek came out first. He had a bag over his shoulder, not luggage, the quick shoulder bag of a man who is not planning to go far. He stood in the driveway and looked at the house the same way he had looked at it when he arrived, but this time with a different calculation behind his eyes. He pulled out his phone and made a call. 2 minutes later, a locksmith's van turned onto my street. Sandra was already dialing when I looked at her. "He's going to try to change the locks," I said. "He's welcome to try," she said, phone to her ear. "He's trespassing on property held in trust, and I have the trustee documents in my hand." "Detective Morrison?" "Yes, this is Sandra Park. I represent Thomas Mercer. We spoke last evening. I need you at 1440 Carrington Lane in the next 15 minutes. I can explain on the way. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I have told this story to a few people since then, and there is always a moment where they ask, 'How did you feel?' watching it unfold. I felt nothing that resembled triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt watching Derek Walsh attempt to oversee a locksmith changing the deadbolts on a house he had no legal claim to, while 2 plainclothes detectives pulled up behind the van and the uniformed officer from last night stepped out of the passenger seat, was something closer to the completion of a long and exhausting calculation. The satisfaction of watching a structure you built hold its weight. Claire was still inside. I had not told her the detectives were coming. I did not know, until that morning, what I was going to do about Claire. Derek saw the detectives before the locksmith had finished. He pivoted immediately to the performance, the concerned son-in-law, the worried about his father-in-law, just trying to secure the property while the family sorted through a difficult situation. Detective Morrison, who had 32 pages of referral documentation on Derek Walsh in her briefcase, let him finish, and then asked him to place his hands behind his back. I watched it on the feed from Sandra's car, parked at the corner of the street. Claire came to the doorway when she heard the voices. She was still in the clothes she had been wearing at dinner. She had clearly not slept. She stood in the doorframe and watched 2 detectives put her husband in handcuffs, and I watched her face on camera 4 for a long time, trying to read it. What I saw was not the face of a woman who is shocked. It was the face of a woman who has been waiting for something to stop. Sandra drove me to the house. I got out of the car and walked up the front path, and when Claire saw me come through the gate, she came down the steps, and I put my good arm around her, and she stood there in the cold for a long time without speaking. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red, and she said, I didn't know about the debt, about the clients. I knew something was wrong. I knew it for months, but I didn't know. I know, I told her. I should have called you. You called me the only way you could, I said. You invited me to Thanksgiving. She looked at me. It was enough, sweetheart. We stood there for a moment in the front yard of the house that had belonged to my marriage and my daughter's childhood and, thanks to Sandra's paperwork, would belong to Margaret's memory long after I was gone. I should tell you about what happened in the following weeks, because that is where the real shape of a story like this reveals itself. Derek was charged with assault, causing bodily harm, fraud, and 4 counts of securities violations that the SEC and FINRA had been building quietly, and that the detective's intervention accelerated considerably. His attorney filed a motion to have the assault charge reduced on the grounds that he had not intended to fracture anything. That argument was not helped by the camera footage, which Sandra submitted with a cover letter, noting she had copies in 3 separate locations. He was also charged with attempted fraud for the quitclaim deed, and for the attempt to change the locks on property he did not own. The securities violations were the core of it. When the full picture emerged in discovery, the private fund, the diverted fees, the falsified statements he had sent to 14 clients, most of them retired, Derek Walsh pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. The sentencing guidelines for federal securities fraud are not gentle. He received 4 years in federal prison and a lifetime bar from the securities industry. The civil judgments from the defrauded clients will follow him for the rest of his life. What happened with Claire is harder to explain in the clean way a story about justice is supposed to end. She moved back into the house with me for a month while her attorney began the divorce process. We spent a lot of evenings in Margaret's reading room, the one Derek had called a waste of square footage, which now held 2 chairs and a small table between them, and which I had stocked with the books Margaret and I used to read aloud to each other on winter evenings. Claire read some of them. I watched her read, and sometimes I thought about how much she looked like her mother, and how much of her mother she still carried, and how close I had come to letting someone take that away. The divorce was final 6 months later. The house in Fairfax, the one I had given them as a wedding gift, became hers. It was her home, not his, whatever his name had been on the deed. She kept it. The scar on my wrist faded faster than the doctors predicted. I still feel it in cold weather. A dull ache in the joint that reminds me of the moment I sat in an imaging room at 11 o'clock on Thanksgiving night and made a decision about what kind of story this was going to be. I could have pressed charges that night. I could have moved immediately. I could have protected myself first and worried about the larger structure later. But I have learned 31 years in federal court will teach you this, that the moment you act is the moment you define what you were building toward. If I had moved too early, Derek Walsh would have been a domestic dispute statistic, a misdemeanor, a fine in a program, and 2 years of watching my daughter stay married to a man who had learned to be more careful. The 14 retired clients he had defrauded would have had no one to call. I waited until the picture was complete, until there was no version of events that a lawyer could stand in front of a jury and rearrange. That is the thing they do not tell you about patience. It is not passive. It is the hardest kind of work there is. I still consult. I still do the pro bono work with the nonprofit. I have added one thing to my schedule. Once a month, I speak at a workshop. Sandra now runs through a partnership with 3 local senior centers. It is a 2-hour session on financial red flags, on the legal structures that protect assets from family fraud, on what a real estate trust looks like and how it works, and why you should not wait until someone is already at your table with a quitclaim deed before you think about creating one. I talk about what early warning looks like. I talk about the difference between a family member who is worried about you and a family member who has begun to see you as a resource. I am not a gentle speaker. I have never been. But the people in those workshops are not there for gentle. They are there because something has already started happening, or because they have watched it happen to someone they know, and they are smart enough to want to understand it before they are sitting in an emergency room with a fractured wrist at 11 o'clock on a holiday. Margaret's roses came back beautifully this spring. Claire came over on a Saturday in April, and we planted 2 new ones together, a variety Margaret had always wanted and never gotten around to ordering. We planted them in the corner of the garden where the light is best, and when we were done, We sat on the back steps with coffee, and I told Claire the parts of the story I had not told her before: the 8 months of preparation, the decoy deed, the room where I had watched them from behind the wall. She listened to all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You waited 8 months for me." I looked at the roses. "I waited until it was right," I said. She put her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. I let her stay there until the coffee got cold. The house is quiet now in the way a house gets quiet when it has earned its peace. Margaret's reading room is where I spend most of my mornings. Her books are still on the shelves, and I have added some of mine, and when the light comes in at a certain angle in early spring, it fills the room completely, and I sit there with coffee, and I think about what she would have made of all of it. I think she would have said, "I took too long." She was probably right. But she also knew better than anyone that some things cannot be rushed, and that protecting what you love is not always a loud, fast, dramatic act. Sometimes it is 8 months of files and patience and a camera above a sideboard. Sometimes it is a single text message at 11 o'clock on a cold November night. The turkey has walked into the oven. Phase 1 complete. I learned something from all of this that I did not expect to learn, because I thought I already knew it. I thought 31 years in a courtroom had taught me everything there was to know about what greed does to people. What I did not fully understand until I watched it happen in my own dining room, at my own table, over my late wife's china, was how completely it blinds them. Derek Walsh was not a stupid man. He was a trained financial professional who understood legal structures and knew how to construct a compelling lie. And yet, he sat in a house full of cameras and threatened a retired federal prosecutor at his own dinner table. He grabbed the wrist of the man whose house he was trying to steal. He thought I was old and grieving and too proud to fight. The mistake was not a tactical one. The mistake was that he looked at me and saw the softness that comes from loss, and he called it weakness. He did not understand that there is a particular kind of person who has spent a lifetime building the patience to wait for the right moment, and who, when that moment finally arrives, does not miss it. I am 67 years old. I have a scar on my wrist and a reading room full of books and a rose garden that needs attention every spring. I have a daughter who calls me on Tuesday evenings and a foundation that carries her mother's name. I have learned that the most dangerous assumption you can make about a quiet person is that their quiet means they are not paying attention. It means exactly the opposite. If this story reminded you of something you have seen or something you are worried about, please leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. And if you believe that preparation is the best protection, that knowledge and patience and the right paperwork are more powerful than any angry confrontation, please like this video and subscribe to Arcane Vengeance. There are more stories here, and every single one of them ends the same way, with the truth.